Penny postcards were the social media of the late 1880s to the beginning of World War I. Travelers would send them to family and friends, announcing their arrival at a destination, as holiday greetings or just to say hello. Mike Weiss of Aberdeen, South Dakota has collected over 5,000 of these Instagrams of the past.
I'm just kind of a bit of a collector and a bit of a history buff, and enjoy the history, and developed, actually found a couple postcards on eBay one time about 25 years ago, and it just so happens to turn out that one of the first ones that I purchased on eBay was from somebody here in Aberdeen who had an interest in postcards as well, and so we struck up a relationship and began to talk about them. I was more interested in the vivid images of the postcards, the photographs. He happened to be a bit of a different kind of a take on the history, and he collected them for the historical significance of the cancellation of the communities and the different evolution of the state as it went from a territory to a state, and all of the different towns that have disappeared now having a collection and being able to chronicle and identify those snapshots in time. So it was something that just kind of evolved, developed, and began collecting, and found ways to expand my collection. So did that and enjoy sharing it.
The second industrial revolution in the United States was a boom in technology in many industries, including photography.
The images are unique because they were from the 1880s through the early 19-teens, and the quality is pretty amazing. Even though they're condensed down into 3.5 by 5 inch postcards, they're not pixelated. They would use large format cameras that actually took long exposures. That's why in some of them you'll see that they're a little bit posed, and if you've got young kids or somebody, they'll look blurred because they actually moved, and it was a period of several seconds that you'd get the exposure, and that's part of the reason why you have so much detail in them. It was basically the easiest format to be able to actually produce it, either mass produce it or produce it. There's a lot of photographs. You've seen the panoramic photographs, where it's a long, wide one that's almost, like 180 to 360 degrees, but they were difficult to produce, and then to be able to market and so forth. The postcard, that format and the technology basically to produce that was pretty ubiquitous, within the industry. And so a lot of times, some of them were made into photographs, but a lot of images wound up on postcards simply because that was the easiest medium to be able to actually produce that, to be able to share it with people.
Many penny postcards sold in the late 1800s and early 1900s were not mass-produced images, but instead single photographs taken by local photographers.
My collection is kind of illustrative of the fact that, there's really small, obscure little communities that there's an awful lot of images of, and it's basically reflective of the fact that you had a photographer that was in that community for a period of time doing business. And so you would have kind of two contrasts. There would be mass-produced penny postcards that would have an image or a modified image, and they were commercially available, and they were basically a penny a piece, and they would manufacture them and distribute them, in bulk. And then there were others that were a single unique image, where you'd have photographers that would take images for a specific purpose, for a specific individual, and it's a one-off, just like a regular photograph would be. And the penny postcard was an easy way. It was kind of the earlier precursor version to a text message these days. A lot of the messages on the back are basically simply, notifying somebody, I made it. I made it to Mobridge, I made it to Aberdeen, I made it to, whichever community is.
Mike Weiss has found that the number of postcards that were produced in different towns and cities is directly based on whether or not a photographer had chosen to set up a business in that community.
One of them that always sticks out to me, for instance, is a small community of Dallas, South Dakota. Got a pretty significant little batch of postcards from Dallas, which never really had a huge population, but there was a short period of time in the land rush days where, just like you used to see in the old westerns and so forth, people came to town and they lined up and they shot the gun and they took off and made their claim. And there's some postcard photographic documentation of some of that in a little town of Dallas, because there was a photographer there who took those pictures and made the postcards, and they're available.
Postcards were often just snapshots of the community printed from a photograph and placed in a local store as a means of income for the photographer and the business owner. However, because the photographer often took photographs of natural disasters such as twisters and fires, these events were also saved for history on penny postcards, along with community events like presidential visits.
Another interesting contrast is if you've got an event like a fire. There was a pretty spectacular fire on Main Street in Mitchell back in the teens when you've got two different photographers with a little bit different kind of an eye and style and so forth, taking images of the same event. There's an interesting one, for instance, of, there used to be traveling circuses and road shows and so forth of actually downtown, just off of Main Street, of somebody about 4 stories up off of, one of those scaffolds who was literally going to jump off of that thing into a barrel of water.
Postcards were also used for promoting events and for advertising.
You've probably seen postcards where they show an ear of corn that's as big as a railroad car, showing produce. You can't grow things as big as you can out in the Midwest. You need to come here because it's the most prosperous place on the planet. Well, maybe not quite that much, but they painted a picture with that, and that was whole part of the marketing program to get people to move here.
The history of South Dakota communities is often word of mouth, passed down from generation to generation. Mike's postcard collection has allowed him to connect people with their family histories.
I've gotten feedback from people that have seen the 2 books that I did with Tom Hayes a number of years ago that have actually had one. This is a number of years ago from a gentleman in Oregon that just out of the blue said, I'm not quite sure, but one of the images that you have of a bird's eye view and stuff, is there any chance I can get a larger view of that? So I sent it to him, and he sent me a letter back and said, a tall drink of water. The gentleman who's on the hand car from the photograph, he said, I can tell from this image that's a photograph of my grandfather, and I was actually there that summer visiting. He said, I've never seen that picture before. He said, I can't tell you how appreciative I am to be able to see that image, because I had it in my mind's eye but never was able to actually see it. So those are the kind of things that kind of give me goosebumps, and I love sharing with people.
Penny postcards being one of the first forms of social media, it is only fitting that the current age of social media that we all live in has allowed Mike to share his love of history and penny postcards.
I've actually got a friend who manages several Facebook pages, and one of them he manages is South Dakota History Images. And so there's quite an exchange of unique images, and it's fun to see what other people have that I don't, or people will have an image that they're not sure of and stuff, and so I'll get tagged in it every once in a while and stuff. It's like, Mike, what do you know, or what do you have, that can help fill in the gaps a little bit with something like this. So I just consider myself fortunate to have had the opportunity with my a little bit of compulsion to be able to get the collection together that I have, and to be able to share it when I can.